Good evening and welcome to our program. Tonight we will be studying from Luke chapter 24, verses 28 through 43. We're quickly coming to the end of the Gospel of Luke, and we are dealing with some of the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus to different individuals. But before we get into that part of our lesson, again, I'd like to remind everybody of all the resources out there that are available. And of course, these resources have always been there for those who maybe are shut in or sick and just simply are unable to be out. But we do need to continue to be good students of God's Word. We need to continue to be connected with other Christians, whether it be through telephone or some type of Facebook or some other type of communication. But even the availability we have here of these various services. The In Search of the Lord's Way program with Phil Saunders out of Edmond, Oklahoma. It's an excellent program. It's on every Sunday on 7:30 on Channel 47 on DirecTV. It's on at 7 o'clock on Dish TV on Channel 239. It's on Spectrum Cable at 7:30 on Sundays at Channel 3. And also the Gospel Broadcasting Network and World Video Bible School. Both of these institutions have a tremendous amount of material, good Bible material. If you want to study any kind of doctrinal material, different doctrines concerning God, the Holy Spirit, Jesus, whether we talk about the church, salvation, or even more devotional material, which some of the Psalms and things of that nature. They have sermons. They also have various Bible classes. So these are very, very good resources. We're blessed to live in a time such as this. People lived in past generations whenever something like this hit, didn't have this availability. So we need to take advantage of the resources that we do have. With that in mind, we come down to Luke chapter 24, beginning in verse 28. And the background of this is Jesus, of course, has been resurrected from the dead. Remember, he was crucified on a Friday afternoon. Or rather died on a Friday afternoon, crucified earlier that morning. And of course, he was raised from the dead sometime on Sunday morning. And the unbelief that comes about, the surprise, Mary Magdalene visiting the tomb first, and then other individuals coming and being shocked and surprised. And so later in the day, we find at some point there's two men walking to the village of Emmaus. Historians, Bible scholars say that Emmaus is 7 miles from the city of Jerusalem, so there's not a real long walk necessarily in those days. So these two individuals are walking along talking about what had happened in Jerusalem. And Jesus appears to them and walks with them, and they don't know who Jesus is. And he explains to them why all these things had happened. He goes to Old Testament prophecies saying that the Son of Man had to fulfill these prophecies. As I mentioned last week, this had to be one of the, at least in my mind, one of the more intriguing events of the Bible. The idea that Jesus was going back to the Old Testament, picking all these passages, these prophecies. It'd be interesting, really curious to see exactly what was involved in that lesson or that sermon. But anyway, as they continue, then we come up now in verse 28. It says, they drew near to the village where they were going, and he indicated that he would have gone farther. But they constrained him, saying, abide with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is far spent. And he went in to stay with them. So Jesus had traveled this 7 miles. He goes in and eats with these two disciples. It says, it came to pass as he sat at the table with them that he took bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they knew him, and he vanished from their sight. We mentioned last week the idea that their eyes were closed. That can have two possible meanings. One is that God miraculously intervened, that they would not be able to recognize who Jesus was, and that's obviously a possibility here. A second possibility, and that's one of the difficulties, especially with the Hebrew language, not necessarily the Greek, but the Hebrew language many times uses an active verb to describe something that's happening passively. In other words, that the fact that their eyes were closed just meant they didn't understand who Jesus was. It wasn't like actively somebody acted upon them. But regardless of it, the point being, at that point their eyes were opened and they knew him, and he vanished from their sight. Many commentators make the point that perhaps their eyes were open when they heard Jesus pray. Jesus seemed to be unique in his prayer life. In Luke, the 11th chapter, we find the disciples asking Jesus to teach them to pray, just as John the Baptist taught his disciples. You would think something's as relatively simple as prayer, which we look at the model prayer there in Luke 11 and also in the Gospel of Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount. The idea of we begin that prayer generally with acknowledging who God is and that God's will would be done and how we treat others and various aspects of that prayer. You would think it would be normal to them. But there was something unique or different about Jesus and his prayer life. And maybe they'd heard him offer thanks before whenever food was being offered. Regardless, the point being that He comes in, and as he begins to offer prayer for the bread, he gives it to them. And then, of course, their eyes were open, and he vanishes from their sight. We notice, we'll look at this a little bit later in our lesson tonight, but this idea of Jesus vanishing from their sight. Jesus' resurrected body was the same. It appears as to what he looked like before he was crucified, but also there's a difference in that body. And we'll get into that discussion a little bit more. And they said to one another, "Did not our heart burn within us while he walked with us on the road and while he opened the scriptures to us?" So they rose up that very hour and returned to Jerusalem and found the 11 and those who were with them gathered together, saying, "The Lord is risen indeed and has appeared to Simon." And they told about the things that had happened on the road and how he was known to them in the breaking of the bread. Now, as they said these things, Jesus himself stood in the midst of them and said to them, "Peace to you." But they were terrified and frightened and supposed they had seen a spirit. And he said to them, "Why are you troubled? And why do doubts arise in your hearts? Behold my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Handle me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." A couple things we want to mention here. First of all, as we've been mentioning throughout these lessons, that Bible faith is based on evidence. Just as we looked at our lesson last week, Jesus didn't ask these two disciples to sort of take a magical leap in the dark and to believe on him without evidence. Rather, he sat down with these Old Testament prophecies. As we mentioned last week, some of these prophecies were made hundreds of years ahead of time, were very, very specific. The nature of Jesus' birth, where he was going to be raised, the nature of his death, what that death accomplished, and many other events in the life of Jesus were fulfilled. And only God could do something like this. No human being could dream up or come up with the amount of prophecies and have them accurately fulfilled as Jesus did. And we're talking just about prophecies concerning Jesus. The Bible is full in the Old Testament of prophecies concerning various nations. Many prophecies concerning the nation of Israel and Judah. Even or prophecies concerning the establishment of the church, the fact that it would be established in the days of the Roman Empire, and also that it would be established in the city of Jerusalem. Many, many other prophecies, again, suggest that the Bible is from God. And so we're reminded that faith is based on evidence. And even though faith is based on evidence, we still see that there's doubt involved here. It's always difficult when we talk about faith and doubt because really, in a lot of ways, the two things go hand in hand. None of us have perfect faith. The apostles didn't have perfect faith. At times, Jesus rebuked them for their lack of faith. And on one hand, you would think that once you come to understand who Jesus is and you understand the Bible is from God and the power that God, or the fact that God is with us and Jesus is with us, you would think that we would never have doubts. But the reality is we continue to have doubts as Christians. As a matter of fact, when we think about doubts, I think the very idea of doubting something is inherent in becoming a Christian. You know, the Bible says that we are to test the spirits whether they are of God or not. And so we need to have a questioning mind, a questioning attitude. When we hear a doctrine taught, we should question it. Is it from God or is it from man? The only way to solve that doubt is to go to the Bible. When Acts chapter 17, Paul preached something new to the people in Berea. It says they searched the scriptures daily whether these things were so. They had doubts, they had questions. And so doubts are not necessarily wrong. Doubting can be sinful at certain times, and the Bible addresses that. When there's ample evidence for something to be true or something to happen, such as the Pharisees who repeatedly had seen miracles of Jesus, and their doubts were more, I'd say, almost of a blasphemy type nature where they condemned Jesus and really condemned his deity. The idea that they had to know he had some divine help, the idea that he could perform these signs or miracles. And so doubting is normal, and these individuals obviously were doubting. They were struggling with it. It says, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts arise in your heart?" He says, "Touch me. I have physically been resurrected from the dead." Luke doesn't mention this, but Thomas is not present at this time. And of course, a week later, when Jesus appears to them, Thomas is the unbeliever. And that's when Thomas actually physically touches Jesus. And as a result of seeing Jesus, his doubts are resolved by saying, "My Lord and my God." But there's another interesting angle here that perhaps what Luke is talking about. There's a doctrine known, began being developed toward the end of the first century. It was called docetic Gnosticism. And basically, the Gnostics were people who claimed to have supernatural knowledge. They were mystics, we might say, in modern day language. But they believed that flesh was inherently evil. And they didn't believe that Jesus was bodily or physically resurrected from the dead. And I think it's significant that the Apostle John, who writes the latest of all the apostles, in his Gospel of John, emphasizes the fact that Jesus did physically, Thomas touched Jesus physically, and Jesus sat down on the beach and ate with the apostles. And so he was bodily, physically resurrected from the dead. And here Luke reinforces that point. And so in 1 John, John deals with this doctrine. He says, whoever says that Jesus has not come in the flesh, that's basically the doctrine of Antichrist, as John deals with that in 1 John. And so anyway, as we look at this, a couple of points again that Jesus sort of just pops in among the apostles. I assume we would say miraculously, supernaturally. And then, of course, their doubt, they're afraid of him. And again, the evidence. He's saying, look at me and touch me, and the idea that I'm bodily resurrected from the dead. Then also he says, peace to you. It's interesting, when I was looking at this, thinking about this statement and thinking about the turmoil we have in the world in general with the virus, and even more specifically within this country over police brutality, race relations, and things of that nature. And really, the idea that the world has always been a world of conflict, and Jesus brings us peace. If you go to Ephesians, the 2nd chapter, we find that the peace that Jesus came to make is, first of all, between us and God. At the cross, Jesus did away with the anger, the enmity that God had toward us because of sin, but also he broke down the barriers between individuals, between Jews and Gentiles. This has always been a world where, for whatever reason, some people look down on other nations, other nationalities. I imagine this probably has happened since the beginning of time. And I'm convinced it's one of Satan's greatest weapons, for me to think that I'm better than either another race of people or another gender of people, or that somehow because a person has a certain nationality, I'm inherently of more value in God's sight. But we've all been created equal in the sight of God, and we need to remember that. And we also need to remember that Christ has the answer to the questions, the problems we face. But also, in the midst of all the conflict we have, we still can have peace. Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers. They're the sons or children of God. Peace doesn't mean the absence of conflict. These same apostles who Jesus promised peace to and addressed them here saying, peace to you, in a few short years, a few short days, really months, they were going to be out preaching and teaching the gospel, being persecuted for what they were doing. So peace doesn't necessarily mean absence of conflict, but it does mean that I have the resolve, the assurance that deep down, that I know that no matter what happens to me, that God is watching over me, and that even if something does happen to me physically, if I have to suffer persecution in this world, that I'm going to a much better world. So having said that, then, the peace that Christ offers is a forgiveness of sins. It's a right relationship with God, and it's really has having the right attitude toward life, that you know what life is about. After Jesus has talked to the apostles and shown him, his body, show that he was physically resurrected from the dead, it says when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. But while they still did not believe for joy and marveled, he said to them, this statement, they didn't believe for joy, most commentators say that they were so overwhelmed they couldn't believe it. It'd be as if someone coming up to you one day and saying, some billionaires decide to give you $1 billion. You'd be probably extremely, happy, joyful, just joyful beyond measure. But then also you couldn't still believe it because it was too good to be true. That's probably the meaning of the language here. It's too good to be true that Jesus actually was resurrected from the dead. He said to them, have you any food here? So they gave him a piece of a broiled fish and some honeycomb, and he took it and ate it in their presence. And as I just had mentioned, the idea that he physically still had a body, that he was bodily resurrected from the dead. This false doctrine is taught in both really 1 John, 2nd, and 3rd John as he addresses it. This doctrine is spread through the early church that Jesus physically could not have been resurrected from the dead. At the heart of this is the idea that matter is inherently evil. With the ancient Greeks, there's a dualism between body and spirit, and many of them believe that the body, that what we see in this world really does not exist, that all of nature, all matter, is simply a figment of one's imagination. And all that matters is one's spirit. And so they couldn't believe that if matter was inherently evil, then how could Jesus truly have a physical body? But the Bible doesn't teach that matter is inherently evil. And so that's perhaps even why Luke included this in his gospel, the idea that Jesus was bodily resurrected from the dead. We're going to spend a little bit of time here about this question of the resurrection. The Bible gives us some hope. It gives us some clues, some answers as to the nature of Jesus after he's resurrected from the dead, and even our own future resurrections. But it doesn't answer all those questions. From what we can see, at least on a few occasions, Jesus seems to have the ability to go through walls, just to appear out of nowhere. Yet even though he has that ability, we find he has a physical body that still has the wounds in it, a physical body that still can eat food. And so as we look at that, we also realize that resurrection of Jesus, and basically, as Paul refers to, is the first fruits of our future resurrection. The Bible teaches that as Christians, we're going to be bodily resurrected from the dead at the return of Jesus. Paul writes about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where some individuals were doubting the idea that as Christians we would live on after the grave. Paul makes it very clear that just as Jesus was resurrected from the dead, that we too can be at his return. And then, of course, the questions people ask about the resurrected body, what does it look like, and so forth. We take up our reading with 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 35. But someone will say, how are the dead raised up, and with what body do they come? That's a natural question. And again, it's a question that's not completely answered by Paul here. He gives us a little understanding about it, but there's not complete understanding. And maybe as human beings, we can't completely grasp what a resurrected body would look like, because it's both physical and spiritual. And with what body do they come? He says, foolish one, what you sow is not made alive unless it dies. And what you sow, you do not sow that body that shall be, but more grain, perhaps wheat or some other grain. But God gives it a body as he pleases, and to each seed its own body. He uses a couple illustrations here about grain. First of all, if we aren't going to really become alive until we're bodily resurrected from the dead, so we physically have to die first. The real life is the life in the hereafter. As different commentators have made, as I was preparing for this lesson, we talk about the end of life and closing a casket and thinking about putting one into a grave. But really, in a lot of ways, that's the beginning of life. That's the beginning of what life is all about. And so this physical body has to die at some point. But again, it's going to be resurrected into a much better body. Second, a grain of you take a little seed of grain, it doesn't grow up into a big seed of grain. Rather, it grows up into a plant. If you plant a seed for wheat, it's going to look different from the actual seed. Corn, you plant a piece of corn, a seed, it will still reproduce itself on the cob, but the plant itself does not exactly look like the seed. And that's the point he's making here, that our resurrected bodies are going to be somewhat different. He says, but God's one who gives it a body as he pleases, and to each seed its own body. So just as God decides in nature what things are going to look like, so he does with us, with our resurrected body. He says all flesh is not the same flesh. There's one kind of flesh of men, another flesh of animals, another of fish, and another of birds. There are also celestial bodies, terrestrial bodies, but the glory of the celestial is one, the glory of the terrestrial is another. One glory of the sun, another glory of the moon, another glory of the stars, for one star differs from one another star in glory. Just as God has in nature given different animals different types of bodies, just as there are different types of heavenly bodies, so to speak, the sun, the moon, the stars, and they're different from maybe what's on earth. It appears some people make the argument that maybe Paul is talking here about different degrees of reward in heaven, and that's a possibility. But the one thing we do know is that the body is going to be different. Regardless, it's going to be somewhat the same, just as Jesus appeared somewhat the same, but also he appeared somewhat different. And then Paul goes on to say, so also is the resurrection of the dead. The body is sown in corruption, raised in incorruption. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. There's a natural body and there's a spiritual body. So it is written, the first man Adam became a living being, the last Adam became a life-giving spirit. Again, Paul doesn't completely answer every question we may have concerning the resurrection from the dead, but he writes here quite a bit of material concerning the fact that we will one day be bodily resurrected from the dead. And that's going to happen at the return of Jesus. Christ said there's an hour coming when all that are in the graves will return to life. John chapter 5 and verse 39. Some to the resurrection of life and some to the resurrection of damnation. And so this is the hope that we have. And when we look at the resurrected Jesus, we know that Jesus was resurrected from the dead and later on would ascend to the Father. And his resurrection is the first fruits of the fact that one day we can be resurrected from the dead. As we bring our lesson to a close tonight, again, reminded of the fact that the faith we have in Christ isn't based on some mystical leap in the dark, but it's the evidence given. The idea that Old Testament prophecies were were fulfilled, and these prophecies couldn't have been artificially fulfilled. There had to be divine help behind this. And second, that Jesus showed his body to those around him after he was resurrected from the dead, and that he, even though it's still spiritual in a sense, he was able to pass through walls that appears undetected. Also, he still had the wounds from the crucifixion, and also he was able to eat food and consume it. We thank you for tuning in tonight, and we look forward to continuing our study of Luke 24 next Wednesday evening.